Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and sticking it out for the final presentation. It means a lot to me. Shout out to my grandparents who are watching right now live. I love you guys. My presentation is entitled A Global Perspective on Feminism. I am most proud of my identity as an intersectional feminist. And before TBB, this was true as well. Feminism is and continues to be an integral part of my life because it has been a way for me to heal from traumatic events, empower myself, and empower others. In 7th grade, I was diagnosed with anorexia. And since then, I've been concerned about and aware of the degradation and objectification of women's bodies. From that point on, I've considered myself a feminist because learning about what caused my eating disorder led me to discover the systematic oppression of women in American society today. In high school, while struggling with my identity and other mental health problems, I was sexually assaulted by my first boyfriend. After something so bad happened to me, I wondered what good can come out of this. And I found that being open about my experience and sharing my story can empower victims who are so often silenced by rape culture to speak up and seek justice. Feminism became a way for me to validate my experience and connect with other victims, and it was also a way for me to heal. As I grew from this experience, I became more and more interested in women's empowerment and sought out ways to learn more about it through books, documentaries, and conversations with my friends, family, and my teachers. I was president of the Gender and Sexuality Alliance at my school and pushed topics like intersectionality and gender bias. I also became involved in my school's feminist club and talked openly about my experiences. I had heard a few times that I had a more global perspective than most people my age and came to a point where I thought of myself as more aware than the average person. But now, as I reflect and re-examine my pre-TBB views on feminism and the systematic oppression of women, I realize how ethnocentric these views were. Even though I worked to make sure my feminism was as intersectional as possible, I had a hard time connecting to issues affecting women outside of the developed world. It wasn't that I wasn't aware of the degradation of the problems necessarily. I have read Half the Sky, and I tried to educate myself by listening to around the globe. But the real problem lied in the fact that it was easy for me to ignore these women when I felt I could not relate to them. I found this experience has given me a broader global perspective on this problem, one that I can relate to for 2 reasons. For one, I learned how similar sexism is felt in developing and developed nations by comparing my own experiences in each. And secondly, because I can no longer think of sexism affecting women without considering all the women I met throughout my journey, in South Africa, in India, and in Ecuador. Because I made personal connections with these people, it's impossible for me to ignore them when I think about what it means to be a woman in this day and age. Sexism I experienced abroad was very similar to sexism I experienced at home. For example, in South Africa, I couldn't walk down the street without being catcalled by men from the community. I knew that women were objectified everywhere, but it was hard for me to conceptualize this when I had never traveled outside of the United States. And this just proved to me how widespread the objectification of women is. In India, I was required to wear a kurta to work every day at a preschool, which is a traditional Indian outfit, in hopes of limiting the attention that I drew from men. And in my high school, I had a dress code as well. I couldn't wear shorts that were too short or tank tops that exposed too much of my skin. And during these times, I felt a similar shame to my body when I was made responsible for making sure that men could control themselves. And despite the dress code in my high school, I was still catcalled in the hallways, and my friends had experiences of being touched inappropriately at school. Every time TBB students and I went to a club to dance and listen to music on our trip was tainted by creepy, predatory men, who often invaded our space and made us feel unsafe. A time that sticks out in my mind was the first club we went to in South Africa called Spotlight. We dressed in casual clothing and went early in the night starting about 8:30, to avoid overly drunk men. However, it wasn't enough. We started out as the only group dancing, and soon a very few very intoxicated men were dancing with us. And it started out as amusing, harmless, until they started targeting the girls in the group, including me, attempting to dance up on us, touch us, and engage us in inappropriate ways. This was never ending and continued throughout the night and throughout my trip. While this was my first time in a club, talking to my friends back home who had more experience and are older than me, I found this happens in the United States the same way. And now I realize too that this type of predation by men is not exclusive to any part of the world. In Ecuador, most of the girls living in El Capital were subjected to aggressive flirtation that bordered on harassment and stalking. Even when many of the boys in Capital couldn't communicate with us, their only language being Spanish, they insisted on telling us that they were in love with us and even requested sexual favors. One instance that happened to me was when a boy, Jonathan, who was 17 from the village, who was also obsessed with me, stood behind me while I was reading on the porch for an hour. And I didn't notice it the entire time until my roommate Maddie pointed it out to me. And I was a little disturbed, creeped out, so I moved inside to the hammock, started reading there, and he moved as well to stand outside the window to continue staring at me. He told everyone in town he was in love with me, but never tried to talk to me or interact with me, except for stares and the occasional caress of my arm or my hair. And still, so many people interpret this behavior as harmless or even endearing, but to me it was dehumanizing. Sure, he may have been shy, and maybe he didn't feel the need to communicate with me in a language I didn't understand, but this didn't seem like a valid excuse because my host family always tried to talk to me in Spanish and I always tried my best. Sure, he may not know the best way to advance, but the fact he claimed so much love for me without knowing me proved he only valued me for my appearance. Also, I knew he felt entitled to me, even though we weren't even friends, because he became visibly upset if I so much as interacted with another guy from the village. But then again, this type of flirtation isn't new to me. Many times, boys have had crushes on me or my friends or showed interest, yet felt entitled to us in some way, acting like we needed to take their feelings into account if we decided to hang out with or befriend another guy. Many times, my friends and I have been harassed by boys who had crushes on us, or been aggressively approached by guys who don't know what no means. This is dehumanizing sexist behavior, where men get away with predatory behavior because it's so often interpreted as flirty and friendly. Before TBB, my only experience with issues that women face globally was what I had heard through the media. The oppression of women worldwide was always presented to me in a way that I felt I could not relate to. Stories of genital mutilation, child prostitution, honor killings of rape victims, and women being stoned to death by their own communities are a few examples. But these are all very real and pressing matters, and sharing these stories is vital to spreading awareness and creating change. But for me, they also made me feel like it was impossible to make my feminism encompass all of these issues. And when I heard about them, they made me freeze. Like, how can I make a positive impact or change the lives of these women? Seeing how the sexism I experience at home and abroad are related in a real way helped me understand that a global perspective of feminism was within reach and extremely necessary. Through empathy and perspective, I learned that the issues facing the women I encountered were more like mine than different. So I made a Venn diagram of my 3 host moms from 3 of the core countries I went to: Cindy in South Africa, Maria from Ecuador, and Poonam from India. Cindy and Poonam are both single moms, and I know many single moms at home, but I've never lived in a single mom household or made such a personal connection with a single mom than I did on this trip. I was shown all the struggles and adversity that comes with being a single mom, and also the incredible power and strength that these women have. The stigma surrounding single moms is strongest in India, where it's still taboo to have sex outside of marriage or to even get a divorce. But even so, the stigma is present throughout the world. My best friend, Lily, has grown up in a single mom household, and through that experience, I learned what it meant to be a single mom in the United States. But I believe that living with these women in South Africa and India gave me what it means to be a single mom. And I was able to notice the common struggles and sexism these women face on a global scale, despite the many cultural and location-specific differences between them. In South Africa, my host mom, Cindy, a Black South African, lives in a poor township riddled with crime. Even though she works a government job that provides her with a stable income, and she's relatively wealthy, she can't move out of the township. Because of apartheid, strict segregation is still a huge part of the landscape. In Ecuador, my Afro-Ecuadorian host mom, Maria, lives in a tin roof house without a safety net or money to be able to provide basic necessities like medicine and even electricity at times. The village consisted of 100 people who also live in a similar state of poverty. Similarly, Maria's ancestors were enslaved by Spaniards who colonized Ecuador. And as we know from racism in the United States, systems in place to oppress and impoverish African people don't disappear after slavery is abolished. Because of this, Cindy and Maria both face discrimination based on their race, causing them to be more impoverished and have less opportunities than their privileged counterparts. Where I grew up, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, I see something very similar to the discrimination faced by these two women. Kalamazoo is very segregated between white and Black neighborhoods. And in the Black neighborhoods, there is less access to healthy food, more poverty, more crime, more drug use, and more gun violence. The women I met on my trip face a similar struggle to women I know in Kalamazoo who live in these neighborhoods. These connections paint a broader picture of the impact of racism on the global community. What these women all have in common isn't as obvious as you may think. Yes, they're all women, and in that they share what it means to be a woman in this day and age. But what does it mean to be a woman now? They all experience the systematic oppression of women in their schools, their healthcare, their law enforcement, even from their peers and their families, whether they register it as that or not. They are all given the immense burden of raising their children and taking on all the tasks that are required to keep a clean and running household. They all grew up and live in rape culture, which silences victims and encourages sexual assault, harassment, and predatory behavior by men. A quote that resonated with me in wake of these revelations is, "My experience is unique, but my struggle is far too common," from the documentary Misrepresentation. I definitely expected to experience a shift in my views at some point during the program to occur as I experienced firsthand issues that I had never seen at home. But the opposite happened. My viewpoint shifted most dramatically when I realized I have more in common with the issues these women face than differences. Moving forward, I will be able to share my new global perspective on feminism with the world by telling the stories of the women I met along the way. Not everyone has the privilege to travel and live with the families like I did, which is why I think it's crucial to share my knowledge as a way for other people to feel connected to the women that they may never meet. This is tremendously important if we feminists want to empathize with women globally and be truly intersectional. Questions? Comments? My mom's crying.
So it sounds like this is an issue that's really near to your heart, obviously. Do you plan on pursuing women's studies in college, or is this potentially a career path, or is this kind of a personal passion for you?
I definitely plan to study gender studies in college, something that's really interesting to me, and be a part of that movement in college specifically. my dream is to be a teacher, but I think, and be an elementary school or preschool teacher, but I think that this awareness starts young. So I think I can apply this to all aspects of my life and teach that in the kids that I work with. I think that's really important. Yeah.
I have two questions, but quite difficult ones. The first is, I mean, if you really look at the source, where this is coming from, right? What is leading you? Is it culture or is it nature, right? So because it's important for where you see the solution. And then there's, in terms of the solution, and I'd also want to ask Kika this question, because she touched on the feminism as well. What would your main answer be to how to resolve it? So is it financial independence of women? You know, it's the structure in society that would help you to, you know, be free of these things.
Well, one quote that makes me think of, and I don't know who said it, was the best way to give up your power is by thinking you don't have any. So I think women are more than half the population, at least in the United States, and we're half the population of the world. So I think if women everywhere stand up for themselves and tell their stories and say that these are real problems, like, we can fix them ourselves. We, like, men are in power now, but we're half the world, you know? Like, we have the power in order to change these things because we exist and we live here. So I think it's a really complicated issue, and it's gonna look different for every country and every situation and every person's life, but I don't think it's nature. I don't think we're genetically predetermined to be better than one another, just in general. I think that's something culture has created. That was a hard question.
You could also say, you know, I want to pursue this. So you could also say that, I mean, where I was struck by what you said, and also by what Keith said, you know, whether you go to South Africa, it's there, you go to Ecuador, the behavior is there, and even in India, it's there, and in the US, it's there. Sorry, and in the Netherlands, but I think in the Netherlands less, if I'm fair, and without being judgmental, but I think. Because we have a very okay.
Listen to your daughter's presentation.
Sorry.
Listen to your daughter's.
Yes, I did. Sorry. So no. Then my question is, if you say it's another view could be that you say, you know, it is part of, you know, we used to hunt and the women did the cooking, whatever. That's where it came from, and basically we're trying to move to a higher level of civilization, right? And then it's. You know, it's culture that has to get us there. I'm struggling with it, having listened to you.
No, I totally know what you're talking about. That's something that me and Chris had a conversation about. Like, when you see that it's so real in every part of the world, like, doesn't that make you wonder, like, is it just because this is how humans are? Or is this a structure we can change and fight against? Or is it always going to be some level of inequality? Like, where is that? How is that going to end or resolve itself? Or is that ever possible? So the question I have, I'd like to think it's not how we're supposed to be, though. I like to think that the world isn't made for men. Because I don't know, that's just one of my beliefs. Yeah, it's hard when it's everywhere to figure out a way to really change that. Thank you. Okay, no, go ahead.
Question. Yeah, so I'm an alum, and I kind of found feminism on my TBB journey, but I feel like I mostly talked about it with, like, other people in my groups, and I never really talked about feminism with my actual host families. And I was wondering if you got to engage in conversations about feminism with some of your host moms while you were there.
I guess in South Africa was where I had most conversations with my host mom about that. She was a single mom, and I talked to her about that and just the women that she saw in her community and how they had been affected by sexism. But the rest of my host moms, that wasn't really a conversation. I had a big language barrier in Ecuador, and in India, off limits to talk about that. But talking with Cindy really opened my eyes to this idea of intersectional feminism. Like, I had known about that, but just how when you experience racism and sexism and how that just kind of magnifies the oppression that you really feel. That was probably like one of the most impactful conversations I had on the trip.
So you talk about how women can change the world for themselves, but you also talk about like all the oppression around the world. So what were some examples of women's agency in spite of adversity that you noticed on your travels? Like what do you think is really empowering to you?
What I saw in India was amazing to me. Like there is such a taboo around Indian women not being married and having a child and working even. And I lived with this amazing woman named Punam, one of the most sweetest people I've ever met. And she had this 11-year-old daughter, and she was empowering her daughter, showing her like a woman can do everything. And like she went to work and cooked and provided for her household without a man in her life. And that I think was a really good example of her like going against everything that society has been telling her. The girls on this trip have been really empowering, the girls I've been traveling with. Like they come from all over the world, some of them. And they all just empower each other and support each other no matter what. Like I feel like we've worked to solve issues within our group just together as girls and really been there for each other in any situation. And I think that's where it starts.